Namaste everyone, my name is Pranav Anand, and in last session we have discussed about testing and initial stages of victimology. In this session we are going to talk about Benjamin Mendelssohn. Now Benjamin Mendelssohn is known as the father of victimology. He coined the term for this area of study in the mid 1940s. Now he was an attorney. As an attorney he became interested in the relationship between the victim and the criminal as he conducted interviews with victims and witnesses and realized that the victims and offenders often knew each other and had some kind of existing relationship. He then created a classification of victims based on their culpability or the degree of the victim's blame. His classification entails the following. His classification entails the following. The first is completely innocent victim. So a victim who bears no responsibility at all for victimization, victimized simply because of his or her nature, such as being a child. Second is victim with minor guilt. A victim who is victimized due to ignorance, a victim who is inadvertently places himself on or herself in harm's way. The third is victim as guilty as offender, voluntarily victim. So a victim who bears as much responsibility as the offender, a person who, for example, enters into a suicide pact. Now the fourth is victim more guilty than offender. A victim who instigates or provokes his or her own victimization. And fifth is the most guilty victim. So a victim who is victimized during the preparation of a crime or as a result of a crime. Now sixth is simulating or imaginary victim. A victim who is not victimized at all, instead fabricates a victimization event. So if you can see all these six categories, that is completely innocent victim, victim with minor guilt, victim as guilty as offender, voluntary victim, victim more guilty than offender, most guilty victim, simulating or imaginary victim. All of this, all of these kind of uh, categorization places guilt on the victim and tries to portray that it is not offender who is at the who is at the first stance created the fight, but is the rather the victim. It is at the instance of the victim that the fight or the crime has opened itself. And you can see there is this element of lawyership or attorneyship has been involved into it. If you look at the 6 points, simulating or imaginary victim, you would say these kind of things would not fall within the ambit of a theorist. It can only fall within an ambit of the person who is practicing the law. So Mendelssohn's classification emphasized degrees of culpability, recognizing that some victims bear no responsibility for their victimization, whereas others, based on their behaviors and actions, do. Now let us come to Stephen Schaffer, Schaffer. Now, one of the earliest victimologists, Stephen Schaffer, wrote The Victim and His Criminals, a study of functional responsibility. Much like Henting and Mendelssohn, Schaffer also proposed a victim typology using both social characteristics and behavior. His typology places victims in groups based on how responsible they are for their own victimization. In this way, it includes facets of von Henting's typology based on personal characteristics and Mendelssohn typology rooted in behavior. Now, he argued that people have a functional responsibility not to provoke others into victimizing or harming them, and that they also should actively attempt to prevent that from occurring. Now, he identifies 7 categories and label their levels of responsibility as follows. The first is unrelated victim. Now, unrelated victims has no responsibility. Provocative victims, they share responsibility because they provoke the criminal. The second is precipitative victims. Now, precipitative victims has some degree of responsibility. Now comes biologically weak victims. Now, biologically weak victims share no responsibility whatsoever. Socially weak victims, they share no responsibility. Self-victimizing, share all responsibility on their own shoulders. Political victims, no responsibility. Political victims, I can say dange, riots, can be example of political victim. Now comes to Marvin Wolfgang. Now, the first person to empirically investigate victim precipitation was Mervyn Wolfgang. And in his classic study of homicides occurring in Philadelphia from 1948 to 1952, he examined some 558 homicides to see to what extent victims precipitated their own deaths. Now, in those instances in which the victim was direct positive precipitator in the homicide, Wolfgang labeled the incident as victim participated. For example, the victim in such an incident would be the first to brandish or use a weapon, the first to strike a blow, and the first to initiate physical violence. Now, he found that 26% of all homicides in Philadelphia during this period were victim precipitated. Now, beyond simply identifying the extent to which homicides were victim precipitated, Wolfgang also identified those factors that were common in such homicides. He determined that often in this kind of homicide, the victim and the offenders knew each other. He also found that most victim precipitated homicides involved male offenders and male victims, and that the victim was likely to have a history of violent offending himself. Alcohol was likely to play a role in victim precipitated homicides, which makes sense, especially considering that Wolfgang determined those homicides often started as minor altercations that escalated to murder. Now, since Wolfgang's study of victim precipitated homicide, others have expanded his definition to include felony rated homicide and subintentional homicide. Now, what is subintentional homicide? Because you all might know what is felony, right? It's petty instances of crime. But sub-intentional homicide occurs when the victim facilitates his or her own demise by his by using his poor judgment, placing himself at risk, living a risky lifestyle, or using alcohol or drugs. Perhaps not surprising, a study of sub-intentional homicide found that as many as three-fourths of victims were sub-intentional. Now, with this, let us come to M. Amir. M. Amir is Menachem Amir. So, the crime of rape is not immune from victim blaming today, right? So what is Menachem Amir saying that the crime of rape is not immune from victim blaming today, and it certainly has not been in the past either. So he was a student of Wolfgang's and conducted an empirical investigation into rape incidents reported to the police. Like Wolfgang, he conducted his study using a data from Philadelphia. Although he examined rapes that occurred from 1958 to 1960, he examined that the extent to which the victim precipitated their own rapes and identified common attributes of victim precipitated rapes. Amir labeled almost 1 in 5 rapes as victim precipitated, and he found that these rapes were likely to involve alcohol and that the victim was likely to engage in seductive behavior, wear revealing clothes, use risk language, and have a bad reputation. Basically, persons of having easy virtue, right? What Amir also determined was that it is offenders' interpretation of actions that is important rather than what the victim's actual does. The offender may view the victim, her actions, words, and clothing as going against what he considers appropriate female behavior. So, in this way, the victim may be viewed as being bad in terms of how women should behave sexually. He may then use or choose to rape her because of his misjudged or misguided view of how women should act, because he thinks that she deserves it, and because he thinks that she has it coming to her. Amir's study was quite controversial because of obvious reasons. It has attacked for blaming victims, namely women, for their own victimization. As we will learn in coming sessions, rape and sexual assault victims today still must overcome this view that women are largely responsible for their own victimization. Now, we will move to the next part of the history, that is history of victimology, and let us come to the victims' rights movement. Now, beyond the attention victims began to get based on how much they contributed to their own victimization, researchers and social organizations started to pay attention to victims and their plight during the mid 1900s. This marked a shift in how victims were viewed not only by the public but also by the criminal justice system. As noted, as you might have noted, scholars begin to examine the role of the victim in criminal events, but more sympathetic attention were also given to the crime victims, largely as an outgrowth of other social movements. Now, till then, uh, till 1960s, concern about crime was growing. This period saw a large increase in the amount of crime occurring in the United States. As crime rates soared, so too did the number of people directly or indirectly harmed by crime. And in 1966, in response to the growing crime problem, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice in US was formed. One of the Commission's responsibilities was to conduct the first ever government sponsored victim survey, commonly known as National Crime Survey. Now, these kind of surveys we will read in coming sessions. Now, importantly, this survey showed that although official crime rates were on the rise, they paled in comparison with the amount of victimization uncovered. Now, this discrepancy was found because official data sources of crime rates are based on those crime reported or otherwise made known to police, whereas the National Crime Survey relied on victims to recall their own experiences. Further, victims were asked in the survey whether they reported their victimization to police, and if not, why they chose not to report. And for the first time, a picture of victimization emerged, and this picture was far different from what was previously depicted. Victimization was more extensive than originally thought, and the reluctance of victims to report was discovered. This initial data collection effort did not occur in a vacuum. Instead, various other social movements that we will see were underway that further moved crime victims into collective nation's consciousness, and this has transcended a nation's boundary and reached to developing countries also. Even in India, the influence of this can be seen in various parts. So, if we will, if at all, we will go further in the session, we will see how the women's movement, how the post-modernist movement, how uh, socialistic movements and Marxist movements has viewed victim, and this has resulted in new understanding of the word victim. So, in the coming session, I will talk about the women's movement, but let me give you the gist of women's movement. So, one of the most influential movements for victims was women's movement, right? In recognition that victimization, such as sexual assault and domestic violence, were by were a byproduct of sexism, traditional sex roles, and their emphasis on traditional family values and economic subjugation of women. The women's movement movement took on as part of its mission helping female victims of crime. Feminists were in part concerned with how female victims were treated by the criminal justice system and pushed for victims of rape and domestic violence to receive special care and services. So, as a result, domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centers started appearing in the 1970s. Now, closely connected to the women's movement was the push toward giving children rights. Now, not before viewed as crime victims, children were also identified as being in need of services, for they could not be the victims of child abuse, could become runaways, and could be victimized in much the same ways as older people. Now, the effects of victimization on children were at this times or of particular concern. Now, in the next session, we'll try to talk about certain concerns from the recognition of women and children as victims, and then we will try to look at the famous civil rights movement that has happened in US. Till then, thank you.